from the lucid fringe. Ravings from the lucid fringe. Musings from an unpasteurized life. Improvised on the front line of love and beauty. Welcome, I'm Semeric Yarrow. This week on Ravings from the Lucid Fringe, episode 51, Expedition to Atlantica, part 2, Mudejar Magic and Flamenco. Flamenco improvising creativity in Granada. It's the season of Corpus Christi, when the body of Christ in the sacrament is celebrated. An early modern Catholic festival. It's big down in Andalusia, it seems. It's a regional public holiday. And it comes from the more intellectual Catholics of the late medieval period. On the outskirts of Granada there's a massive associated festival that I avoid, although half the city seems to have headed out there. Stalls and casitas and fairground attractions, apparently. But there's also processions in the downtown streets, which are lined with soft green pine needles to make a natural carpet for the women with castanets, the men in suits, and the giant puppets of religious figures. This includes a big display of the Holy Family, with a child Jesus carrying a cross, stepping out of linear time into the annual cycle. To dive into the Catholic tradition here is kind of essential to understanding Spain and its regions. Even though Jorge, my host for a couple of days here, insists the numbers of churchgoers is declining rapidly, they still are a self-evidently dominant part of Spanish culture. And in Granada's cathedral, the fantastic displays at the altar of characters and hierarchies is a reminder that one aspect of this tradition is very much about who's above and who's below. Seville's Semana Santa festival is very well known, but also the fun is apparently based on which club you can afford to join, as the best parties happen in exclusive tents. Seville is also a big centre for Opus Dei, whose existence I only knew about until recently from stories about Vatican conspiracies. A secretive, highly rigid organisation within the church. Raquel, who grew up in Seville, told me of people she knows who remain tied to it. That's a contrast with her own ancestors, who were more involved with what sounds like the liberation theology side of things, that Latino left-wing class struggle version of Catholicism. For it is, as the cliché goes, a broad church. Perhaps Madrid's cathedral, opposite the royal palace there, is an example of a funkier breed of Catholicism. Some guidebooks describe it as unloved, but I think it's fabulous. Madrid doesn't have medieval churches because it's a Renaissance origin city to all intents and purposes. But it seems, even though contemporary Mexico City's Zócalo is dominated by its great Baroque cathedral, that Madrid doesn't have one of those either. Instead, the great church got a competing history of styles, leading up to wonderful Art Nouveau and then 70s pop art stained glass windows. It was finally completed in the 1990s, after centuries of architectural arguments and experiments. Fabulous Madrid style. Granada's cathedral is by great contrast an imposing, grandiose affair, a late Gothic wonder, even as the Renaissance was beginning elsewhere. It had to be for the kind of statement its patrons wanted to make, for Granada is where the last Moors handed over the keys of the city to the Catholic monarchs, as Ferdinand and Isabella are known. With the Islamic rulers finally subjugated by a monarch from Castile and another from Aragon, Spain, as the whole country it is today, would come into existence in 1492, the same year that Columbus reached some islands off the Americas on behalf of the same Catholic regal couple. So it's in Granada that they're buried, along with their daughter, Joanna the Mad, who wasn't mad, and her husband, Philip the Handsome, who wasn't handsome. You can pop down in the crypt and see their tombs, which are actually rather plain, perhaps in that typically Catholic regal attempt to appear pious and frugal after all. In Hinduism, which I'm personally more familiar with, the traditional fourth stage of life, renunciation, is advised a little earlier, when mature enough to let go of worldly cares, but I guess better late than never. After the Christian reconquest of Spain was complete, as we know, the brutal process of assimilation began, but it was never completely finished. People with secret Islamic or Jewish beliefs were infamously sniffed out by the Inquisition at royally sanctioned autos da fe, tests of faith, in the plazas mayor around the country. These great central rectangular plazas with multi-story buildings around them were the sites for other great events, including bullfights and royal performances. Madrid famously has the blueprint with its elegant red walls and arches. I would see smaller versions in Córdoba and later in León. But in Granada's museums I see old photos of the Gitano gypsy culture too, captured for their exoticism here at home by those with more privileged viewpoints and technology. Of course, as I'd soon experience firsthand, the Gitano culture and Andalusian culture more generally is very blended, and many southern Spaniards could probably find a Gitano ancestor somewhere, even if overall they're officially a smallish minority today. And the first great oppression against them was in 1499, when they were forced to assimilate alongside Muslims and Jews in Catholic monarch laws. The official discrimination against Gitanos as well as other non-Christians continued until the end of Franco's regime, perhaps not surprisingly, and those locals I spoke with tended to be wary of Gitanos for their involvement in the drug trade. Getting involved in the underworld is pretty standard for any group, prevented historically from living their lives more openly, and drugs that offer a degree of freedom from oppression, however briefly, have always been part of that. And nomads with a culture that the centralized state doesn't like have done pretty badly everywhere in recent centuries. I didn't visit the hillside caves of Sacramento, where hippies and gitanos hang out, beyond the winding pedestrian-only alleys of the Moorish quarter of the Albaicin. Perhaps I'd get a better picture there of Granada's grungy, ancient underbelly. For by mixing with the passionate and at times aggressive and scary cultures of the marginalized, Granada and Andalusia have given the world much fiery creative richness that continues to develop. Dance is a fundamental part of that. My first night in Granada I stayed with Carlos, who had just returned from a biodanza class. That's the Chilean origin free dance form to help you find your inner Latino, as I used to joke. And he was heading off to Orgiva for the weekend to a contact improvisation retreat. If I'd had more time, I might have headed there too, for Orgiva is the southern Cape Peninsula of Spain, a somewhat upmarket but spiritually seeking place in the foothills of the mountains, where two South Africans I know have been based recently. My first dance experience on this trip, however, had been already in Madrid, where I took in my first flamenco show. In Madrid, and even more in Seville and Granada, there's lots of flamenco shows as tourist entertainment, but I'm not really up for that. The words sanitized and formulaic come to mind in that mindless Spotify curated way. Instead, I visited a show of young up-and-coming flamenco artists with a local audience and three distinct categories. Firstly, a local Madrid troupe performing in blazing rose-pink outfits. The energy of the lead male dancer showed a kind of potent masculinity many men around the South African braai pit might struggle to recognise. One young ballerina bounded across the stage like something out of Swan Lake to give a counterpoint to the driving, rhythmical toe-tapping of her peers. Another troupe was a sharp contrast, not least because they were from Mexico City, so they toned it all upside down in wild, clashing coloured costumes, throwing in spoken words and improvised drama to echo the clip of those heels, displaying the virtuoso skills of the style while taking it somewhere entirely different. And a third group was the classic trio format, all in black, the flamenco guitarist riffing off the female dancer's moves as she in turn was riffing off the emotional intensity of the cantor singer. It is this format that I see and hear in Granada's Albaicin, paying cash only to a club venue that's pretty gypsy, says my host. I'm blown away by the fluidity of the guitarist, though Jorge claims to have heard even better. I'd heard a busking old guitarist on my own first wanderings through the quarter, under the arches of the old walls, as well as another Japanese busker who's been picking up the style and throwing himself deeply into the musical culture of the region. The international nature of flamenco these days, as indeed it was a mezcla of cultures from the beginning, has thrown up here a series of academies for further study that are open to a global interest, and indeed, why not? Why should classical music, opera and ballet, or American jazz and the contemporary mainstream dance of the 20th century be the only such styles recognized as worthy of major international study, in the university system particularly? They're obviously not, even if in the remaining university-trained portion of my mind folk musics and styles are something from beyond the canon. And so, the wailing cantaors here are singing for dance graduates of the academy. I can tell that one is from the US dance system, even if she's got a Latino name and can move with a skillful range of flamenco gestures, because she has a habit of looking at the audience and smiling. I've told plenty of dancing teenagers to do that myself, and it's uplifting in the context of musical theatre for sure. It's also completely unnecessary in flamenco, which is raw and honest and passionate and not always smiley. The Mexican dancer that comes second has more of that real feel and is exciting to watch. The solo final dancer is one of the teachers, and she oozes decades of working with this dramatic, sensual, intensely rhythmical form. I'm reminded here again of why I search for the margins, even as they're being assimilated everywhere into the global soup. It's about allowing those expressive roots we all have, even those that were, for a time, pulverized into politeness by the Victorians, to find expression again. There's spirit there, there's soul, there's, of course, the raging dance of the goddess. And if I'm finding it is a little bit edgy, taking me once more out of my comfort zone, life is taking me there with a handful of well-fingered Euro notes. Olé! Granada has more static artistry too. The first paintings I saw here were of a different nature, in the Fine Arts Museum, itself in the heart of Charles V's Baroque palace there, a Christian addition to the reason everyone has come up the hill of the Alhambra in the first place. And although Granada produced its own renowned painters over the centuries, the ones I looked at were by another visitor to the region, the Catalan painter Santiago Rusiñol, who spent much time in the complex and captured impressions of the gardens alongside much else of the spirit of the palace. It is impossible not to be inspired by the Alhambra, assuming you've booked your tickets early for what is now Spain's most popular paying attraction. One can still imagine the resident artists of the past spending quiet times in the rooms and the gardens, as their value was once again being recognized and the architecture restored. I dived into the throng and came face to face for the first time with the detail and magnificence of this place, home of the new Nasrid emirs, once power had been wrested from Cordoba to the west, which I would visit next. The intensity of the working in marble, in wood, in space, was perfect to see in the morning light. The Arabic arches I was getting used to, extending into elaborate horseshoe shapes, were also balanced by the most incredible geometric stalactites. Those hillside caves, taken somehow to a sublime level of mathematical artistry, with the tumbling rock of Muqarnas taking the breath away with every look heavenwards. The theme of temples that emulate and improve on nature's own caves is going to be a recurrent theme on this trip. That understanding of the power of entering the dark and re-entering the light. The details of the tiling here, however, began a new light bulb moment for me. Ceramic tiles are azulejos, probably named for the most common colour used, azul, blue, which is another of those Iberian words coming from the Islamic world. The light bulb understanding I got was more about cultural transfer, the beautiful tiling and ceramics which I'd also seen in Baroque Mexico, as the art of Islam, taken through the colonizing of Iberia, reached the Americas. The Talavera blue and white pottery of Puebla, for example, looks remarkably similar to the traditional pottery of the region around Granada, and both were sold to the Spanish court. Then there are the intricate mini mosaic patterns you can buy in the markets downtown around the cathedral, rebuilt in homage to the Islamic past, after an explosion destroyed the previous version of the market, which might or might not have had something to do with a gunpowder shop there back in the day. After the masterpieces within, however, is the masterful natural piece without, even as the crowds swell. Shade in the heat, hedges with elegant trims. And here I found again the power of water and that Arabic working with it. Staircases in the gardens of the Generalife, spelt General Life, sounding rather like an insurance policy, but it's much more elegant, I promise you. And there's banisters there that are actually containers for flowing rivulets, streams guided off the mountain leading to avenues of trees and plants of the south, and with roses, for it's probably here, in medieval Europe's earliest continuous official gardens, apparently, that the rose appears as a symbol of romance and connection, and for the heart in its multi-layered five-fold form. Knights elsewhere took a while to realise that the rose wasn't just a shield symbol for battle, but still, it's a nice idea for all the thorns. And the ephemeral nature of flowers, the joy they bring, is something I'd also tune into in the Carmens of the Albaicin. Some, no doubt, began life as the homes of merchants and dignitaries of the Nasrid state, and then they were taken over by the new Christian smart set, who enjoyed continuing to develop the gardens and patios within their secluded walls. Today, the proximity of Islamic North Africa and the heritage it brought is generally obvious and welcomed in Granada, where I sipped tea and ate Arabic sweets, as well as falafels. After all this quiet and contemplation, my nights in Granada were rather more raucous. On one I sat to tune into a rapid conversation between Carlos, Jorge, and another Carlos, 3 Spanish SEO experts, all finding their way optimistically and rapidly to other alternatives to stay ahead of the appetite of what is still called by those propagandists promoting it inteligencia artificial, IA, while we enjoyed free tapas and prepared for an evening open mic night. It turned out that the new Carlos was a fine Spanish guitarist in his own right. It was a rich evening featuring my piano chops, unexpectedly, as well as a lovely range of other cross-cultural things. Spanish folk classics, originals from a tall German man and a softly singing French woman, and as passionate a version of Metallica's Nothing Else Matters with additional flamenco trills as you will ever hear, from a trio with a Spanish singer and a long-haired Englishman who's made Granada his home base. All introduced by a guy I thought was Spanish but turned out to be Greek. More moments of pure soul in a place full of spirit. This gathering was a weekly occurrence, but this was the last one for the season. My hosts reckoned the city was going to empty rapidly in the weeks to come, particularly with the school holidays, longer in Spain than other parts of Europe, and the rising summer heat. Jorge's 4th floor flat was definitely more bearable because of the fan I had going all night. It would be some weeks after my arrival in Spain and considerably north of Madrid that I would first need more than a sheet for a nighttime covering. Another night we gathered for an intercambio evening where I encountered an Englishman who'd moved to Malaga but spoke impeccable rapid Spanish and was much more than a beach bum, though also 1 or 2 foreigners who were lovely but spoke little of the local language. English, as a lingua franca even in Spain, makes it no doubt easier for those with the means to travel worldwide, but you miss so much, I think, by being unable to communicate easily with the locals. Jorge showed me a bunch of little nooks and crannies and unexpected sights that the average tour guide would definitely miss when taking you around in English. One little titbit I can share is of the number of streets it's worth translating and pondering, like the Street of Boys Fighting or the Street of the Kiss. Centuries of human stories to explore here. Others present at the intercambio were a scientist who works in checking levels of toxicity in food. I was reminded that health and safety is a big modern European phenomenon. I can see the point, but it does seem to restrict small-scale entrepreneurs at times. The numbers of tests and checks and hoops to jump through for the current regulatory framework is something that bureaucracies thrive on and people don't necessarily benefit from as much as is claimed. It brings on a special kind of first-world claustrophobia. Another guy was an expert on local trees and reforestation out in the beautiful landscapes around the city. We were sitting in a plaza near to another grand church, from which strains of violins were beginning to emanate. The Classical Music Festival of Granada was taking place over the early summer, adding yet another note to the sophistication of the buskers on the street. My last evening in Granada was a magical final snapshot of the essence of the place, I think. I met Jorge and another friend in an old courtyard at the top of the Albaicin hill. Beneath the circling swallows, in the long light of the summer solstice, we sat on makeshift chairs with drinks from a pop-up bar while an original rock band wrapped up. And then a young local woman, wearing a gorgeous hand-crocheted outfit that would outshine most fancy factory stuff, sang her heart out over a keyboard with a range of her own tunes and quirky, sensual lyrics. It was a perfect occasion. Most of the audience watching the show, a few listening in from an abundant garden above that instead looked out over the city. I thought back to occasions in the old Muslim quarter of Buakap on the slopes of Cape Town's Signal Hill. Thought of the colour and the edgy vibes there too. But in old Spain the colour is all over and the nighttime culture is vibrant. And there was a crowd. Not here for mainstream tunes following the narrow melodic and harmonic hit formula that dominates and limits commercial music in the 2020s, but for someone being creatively authentic. I felt gratitude for being alive, and in this spot, as the solar cycle turned again. Mudejar magic and cigarettes. Final Andalusian flourishes. I make it early in the morning to Córdoba, officially Europe's hottest city. Today the temperature will get up to a pretty typical 39 degrees Celsius, but I'm not actually here on some sort of self-punishment quest, but to find out why on earth this very sizzling place was the regional capital of two empires. First, I drop my luggage at my hostel, which is snazzy and a bit soulless. The door seems to operate by QR code. I only later notice it does have a human intercom option in case of emergency. The mixed dorm has bunks that look more like a ship cabin and no windows, which is not necessarily terrible in a place that needs to stay cave-like cool. But I duck straight out again and walk to the centre of the town. En route, I pass a Roman temple, and later I see the dug-out remains of a Roman theatre under the main museum. The Iberian provinces were closely tied, it seems, to the Italian ones, so much so that certain famous emperors were born here, like Hadrian, who had that wall built to manage the terrible weather up north, and Trajan, literally the original fascist. Trajan notoriously exterminated the Dacian people of today's Romania, then bragged about it with a triumph, minting coins featuring himself spearing Dacians, and constructed an elaborate column showing gory scenes of Roman barbarism. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, writer of gruesome tragedies and tutor to Nero, who eventually committed suicide on Nero's orders, was also from this part of the world. The bizarrely dark morality of the Roman period is pretty intense whichever way you cut it, and quite possibly the flaring heat of the Córdoba region made things even starker to those raised here. There are a bunch of prettier coins on display here, as well as a surprisingly elegant lion, just to remind me that I shouldn't get too binary in my opposition to the Romans myself. Some of them were no doubt kind and artistic. The coin theme, though, is one that will pop up more often further north. Hoarding stuff seems to be a common idea among these Atlanticans. In Madrid, this took the form of shops selling collectible items of recent plastic toys, Smurf fads and the like, which briefly attracted my shop window attention. It's pretty obvious that when a culture has been as focused on material possessions for as long as the West has, there's going to be a lot of junk people are into. Some of which is fabulous, but it's also like a whole culture that's got attics to clear. What I have booked for in advance, though, is the big tourist attraction and spiritual masterpiece here. Because Córdoba is better known for being the capital for many centuries of the Caliphate in Iberia, during the Islamic Golden Age and before the Nasrid kings in eastern Granada took the number one spot. And the Mosque Cathedral is the heart of that. For years I've shown students flat images of the double vaulting, the space it created, the architectural beauty of the two-tone arches, of the arches within arches, of the sculptural imagination in the building. Visiting in real life is breathtaking, the pillars stretching away as if to infinity, giving a sense of equality of all before God. Although not quite, because the Maksura area for the Caliph and his family, shielded from assassins in their own chapel, is still more exquisite and quite different to the rest of the building. Some people complain that the Baroque cathedral in the middle of the mosque, pushing upwards like cathedrals tend to do, reaching for the light, is a destruction of a magnificent building. I disagree. It shows the movements of history and seems to integrate what has come before and what is happening in a later period. The arches morph, the links are maintained with sensitivity and elegance. On the other hand, I disagree too with a tour guide who is claiming that the Baroque part is somehow superior, bringing the light after the darkness of the Islamic period. That view is arrogant rot. There's religious tension here for sure in what is a functioning Roman Catholic Church. There's a display, for example, on how important the early pre-Islamic Christians here were for the birth of Roman Catholicism in the 4th century. Hardly any Western Europeans actually attended the pivotal and infamous Council of Nicaea, but the bishop here was one of them, with access to the Emperor Constantine's ear. But the building itself is better than that. It speaks to a blending, a tolerance that the building demanded of those looking to alter it, something much truer than harsh fundamentalist words. I visit it again the next morning and am struck by the different qualities of light and the peace the place exudes. I'm in town on a Sunday, and so there's lots that's not open, including many of the patios, which are one thing the Romans might have instigated in the courtyards of their villas, but the Arabs refined with their plants, and that is hinted at all over the town. But that opens me to other things. I visit a townhouse from the Islamic era that retains good taste and is decorated with rugs, tea sets, and a library of books, including many on Sufism, the version of Islam that perhaps takes us most beyond opposites and binaries and towards active spirituality, and which was an important part of culture under the Caliphate. There's also a marvellous display on alchemy, the magical forerunner of chemistry, or perhaps what you get when you mix chemicals and poetry. The display hints at all kinds of metaphysical properties and connections between things that expand beyond modern materialism. Salts produced from morning dew on the hillsides, remedies with links to the visible planets and their connection to alchemical elements, Andalusian substances refined by speaking words of the Quran over them, and balancing moon and sun aspects, and solid purified mercury from the Vedic alchemical tradition. This is fascinating. I know little of ancient Indian chemistry and its relation to Ayurvedic health, except that there's an ancient iron pillar in Delhi showing highly advanced understanding of building corrosion resistance. There's a paradigm of knowledge here that stretches across modern disciplines, brings things together. Ancient Indian numbers are clearly not the only things that Arabs adapted and brought to the West. Modern science is indubitably tied to Arabic thought and discoveries, and also, perhaps even more crucially, looking at the library again, gathering and debating of knowledge from different ancient traditions. A flame that sets water spiralling as one little piece of magic on the alchemical patio. Time was that Cordoba was a city bigger than anything in medieval Western Europe, with an unquestionably more refined culture. The old Jewish ghetto nearby was a part of that culture too. Today, it's a quarter where I find drama schools and artisans reinvigorating and rediscovering old textile traditions. The synagogue itself is closed today. There is a Jewish community once more in modern Spain, after many centuries, although mostly in bigger cities further north than Andalusia. The ambivalent nature of Franco's fascism, tied to conservative Catholicism but not specifically anti-Semitic, meant that many Jews escaped Europe via neutral Spain during World War II. But only in more recent decades have they been allowed to stay and practice their faith publicly again. As I head out for a little tapas at 9 p.m, when the light is still bright and the temperature is slightly cooler but still in the mid-30s, I hear powerful military brass music pounding out in the streets. A Corpus Christi parade of monks, nuns, bishops, Catholic orders, soldiers bearing rifles, and a host of other upholders of the civil organisation are marching through, with plenty of ordinary churchgoers standing and applauding in their Sunday best. In my t-shirt and shorts and snapping away, I feel mildly blasphemous, but if this is conservative Spain at work, I have to admit it's pretty stylish. Earlier I got another kind of echo of the pervasiveness of these Catholic roots in the heart of Cordoba, in the house museum of the painter and leading citizen Julio Romero de Torres. He took the classic religious imagery and storylines of Catholicism and reworked them mischievously, with vibrant and modern 1920s women modelling in place of traditional retiring Marys, capturing his versions of his contemporary city with fondness rather than anything too austere. I head away from the procession and back to the food, which in Cordoba includes mazamorra, a tasty almond and bread cold soup from the days before there were any tomatoes to make gazpacho. I guess that's what this region is about. It's ancient in so many ways, and while tradition can be stifling, it's also worth really delving into to find out why different kinds of creative activity continue to thrive and be valued. The bread soup with tomatoes in Granada was thick salmorejo, which I ate as part of a supper high up in the Albaicin. We had avoided one bar which was renowned for their Granadan speciality of tortilla with pig's testicles. I mean, I'm all in favour of making maximum use of agricultural products, of course, but I took the lead from my friend. Next time, perhaps. I'm not the world's biggest shopper, but window shopping in Andalusia is still a good way to get a sense of the region and what it claims to offer. My Granada hosts, who'd both grown up in other parts of Spain, pointed out, for example, that those classic multi-layered Andalusian dresses, often one bright colour and sometimes with added black spots, are taken very seriously by the women wearing them. It's a regular part of life there, particularly in important religious seasons. But the way flamenco dancers use them as an extension of their movements is a way of bringing them to life a lot more. They're sometimes accompanied on the streets by abanicos, fans, which were for sale everywhere, with a fantastic range of decoration. I saw a little girl on the Madrid metro using an electric-powered handheld version, but it was in the south of Spain that I realised for the first time that these things are really pretty essential parts of life here at times, not just the pretty tourist souvenirs they've become. Bizet's Carmen, set in Seville, has a lot to answer for. Ah, that French opera again. The Belle Époque fascination in France for exotic stories from over the Pyrenees. In the story, Carmen is a worker in Spain's second largest building by footprint, the great tobacco factory of Seville, where she was envisioned as one of the cigarreras, the women-only labour force rolling cigarettes and cigars there. This 18th century building, now the Humanities Faculty of the university, was a grand symbol of Spain's other forms of New World treasure, beyond the more obvious silver and gold, and is still an impressive memorial to the hypocrisy of the so-called Enlightenment. The sacred herb of Native Americans become the consumer drug of choice, marketed from here in Seville, the city that benefited most from the conquistadors' actions in the Americas. The workers, like the fictional Carmen, were mostly from Triana, the poorer suburb across the river from the centre of power. I explored it briefly, including a look at some of the azulejo factories, most of which have now closed, but with much history and artisanal pride in these blue and white squares of tiling. Today, some workshops are reforming and reopening. Artistic tiles and mosaics were very visible in the grandest of Seville's public places, the Plaza de España, where in the evening the crowds were gathered, picnicking around different zones that were dedicated to the different cities and regions of the country. Elegant, stylish, fresh and colourful. A modern building explicitly designed to be permanently open for free to the public, a kind of magnificent Art Deco national secular version of a cathedral. And rather less successful than had been hoped back in the preparations to the Iberian-American World Fair of 1930 here. The Wall Street crash turned attention away from a Spain that was embracing democracy, and probably helped foment the discontent that would lead to civil war. So it's a little bittersweet to spend time here remembering a moment that never was quite. The adjoining park features other pavilions for all the former Spanish colonies, as well as the neighbouring Iberian state. Portugal, curiously, gets a pagoda. For Macau, their Chinese colony, if you engage in a little lateral thinking. One fellow tourist on the Spanish language tour I'm on repeats a curious myth that Christopher Columbus was actually Portuguese, and hiding that fact given the rivalry between the two Catholic nations. I'd only previously heard of his Genoan origin, which made basic historic sense to me given the history of Genoa and the other maritime republics in medieval trade and exploration. The famous Meridian Division, drawn on a map by Pope Alexander VI to prevent the two nations fighting, really shows their incredible 16th century dominance of the world, with the Portuguese thenceforth heading east to pagodas and such like. The two cities that were most enriched by this global onslaught were Seville, the closest big Spanish city to the Atlantic route and far enough upriver to prevent pirate attacks on the gold landed here, and Lisbon, my next destination, which seems to me almost fantastically close. In a remarkable piece of karma, perhaps, Lisbon's calamitous earthquake and tsunami in 1755 also cracked Seville's Torre del Oro on the Guadalquivir River. However, this rather dramatic watchtower is actually a relic from the great days of the Almohads, who liked glittering things, rather than a storage place for all the gold that was pouring into this place at one stage. The results of the gold's arrival are seen in other places in the city, the cathedral probably being the most stirring example. Yep, another Spanish city, another incredible and unique central religious building. Seville Cathedral is, in fact, the second largest church in Europe after St. Peter's in the Vatican. If I thought the city of Cordoba was pretty Catholic, and Granada's cathedral pretty impressively Gothic, this place is next level on both counts. It's full, of course, of both tourists and worshippers, and my first port of call is the bell tower, or Giralda. Round and round the square tower we go, on a pilgrimage up to the viewpoint and the massive bells. The base of the tower features a block from a Roman temple, the tower's builders clearly saying, "We stand higher than you." But they were Muslims. The path slopes upwards without steps because for centuries the imams would ascend on horseback to launch the call to prayer. And then the Christians came and put bells on top, continuing the game of one-upmanship. The original entrance to the main building, too, leading into the patio of orange trees, is a gorgeous horseshoe arch. For there was a mosque here, too, perhaps not as grand as at Córdoba, but very much a statement of the 13th century city before the Christian conquest. The interior, however, calls for too many superlatives. Chapels everywhere, each one full of Renaissance and Baroque art dedicated to leading families who funded this thing. And a central altarpiece that is decorated in elaborate gold with imagery that practically tells the whole Bible. It's dazzling as intended. It's also inspiring for this non-Catholic as a tribute to the variety of the divine. I can't help thinking, though, of the brutal colonizing that went alongside it. It's pretty intense to see the tomb of Columbus, or Colon, or whatever he actually was, besides an incredibly arrogant man who was convinced till he died that he'd discovered India. No attempt at pious humility, it dominates the corner of the cathedral where it stands, which, given the general size of things here, is no small feat. Religious and cultural tolerance is, however, surprisingly on display at the Royal Alcazar. Pedro I of Castile, the Cruel, is so named because he apparently cracked down on certain nobles and churchmen abusing their 14th century power. When they later installed a compliant usurper, his memory had to be discredited with this nickname, the Cruel. Other factions objected and renamed him the Just. Perhaps quietly among these were the many Muslim and Jewish workmen operating here, some of whom were sent to Pedro by his buddy, Mohammed V, King of Granada, who was overseeing the latest developments at the Alhambra. And so what we have at the heart of the Christian monarchy's palaces here is Mudejar architecture, Islamic style, often Islamic workmen, creating another legendary sequence of architectural splendour. It's my last big sample of what the south of Spain has to offer, intricate and delicate and full of innovative ways to capture the cosmos inside a building. Later extensions into the lovely gardens show the use of stucco to recreate an organic rock appearance. This, I realise, is another attempt to recreate nature in a way that shows both the natural and the artifice. I also spend more time than I intend trapped in a hedge maze. I'm used to gently contemplative labyrinths, one way in, one way out. Having to think and figure out and remember in the moment without getting frustrated or impatient is an interesting practice in itself. Many Castilian monarchs were fighting the crusade against the infidel and sending their officers out to do the same in the Americas. Yet there was also a creative infusion happening that some recognised and encouraged, and others couldn't quite stop if they wanted to. I visit the archive of the Americas too, opposite the Alcazar, which has an infinity of contratos for researchers to explore if they so wished. Contracts that bind, the soft and economically deadly aspect of imperial power abroad. While we all know of the bloody destruction of the initial Spanish conquest in the Americas, there's also a note on some of the later thinking. Spain became the only European colonial power to actually deliberately educate the natives to a high level, with tertiary institutions established from early on and not just for the children of colonists. This is why UNAM in Mexico City became the largest university in the Americas. When we recognise the massive damage done by colonialism, we shouldn't flatten the story too much. There were individuals within those centuries pushing for something more, valuing something closer to a true morality. I recall the great library of Puebla in Mexico, for example. Things to ponder as I spend a little time exploring modern Seville. I get a haircut because obviously the thing to do here is go to the barber. Get it? And after this moment of simple connection, I wander under Las Setas, the remarkable mushrooms made of wood that tower over the square near my hostel, which is a former convent with marble everywhere, much more evocative than where I'd stayed in Córdoba. Apart from a moment of breathing in the river and the trees in the park, this has been a very urban experience, and the largest wood building in the world kind of confirms that. Then I walk through some less touristy areas. The main contemporary art gallery is surprising and has some very Euro-American first world self-referential stuff I don't really get, but other work from a Spanish artist, Regina de Miguel, uses multiple layers of media. She seems to be trying to find a way to Gaia and the divine feminine through the filaments of metals and technology, and reimagining the pulsing soul of the world, or through arranging stones in structures which will echo through the later stages of this big journey. That lifts my soul again. As does the aubergine and molasses I have with a 0% beer, or the range of traditional circular shortbreads available here in bulk, which I recognised from Raquel's kitchen. I head in a new direction for some final tapas for now, stopping for a while in an ordinary square beside another two-tone church in Seville's colours. Individual worshippers are leaving the service for San Juan la Baptist, and kids are enthusiastically kicking a soccer ball in their Sevilla tops. Behind me I hear Slavic sounds, except I soon realise it's Brazilian Portuguese, which is like Spanish spoken by Russians. I wander through the trendier part of the centre where there are tattoo parlours and vegan tapas on offer, and I finally walk to the bus stop, where I'll wait in the wind, a welcome relief, and then sleep my way across the border to the west, where I'm going to hear a lot more almost Slavic speech. So, thank you for listening to this latest episode in the series, and you can find all of my articles and my recordings at lucidfringe.substack.com, except my music and poetry from the past, which is all available at simrickyarrow.bandcamp.com, and the background recordings and sounds that you will have heard are all either from those recordings or they are my own. Please do give this a rating if it's on your podcast app. Please spread the word if you enjoy what you hear, and if you want to give me some feedback or commentary, of course I'm very open to that. Any suggestions for future episodes? Okay, enjoy. See you next time. Ravings from the Lucid Fringe. Ravings from the Lucid Fringe. Musings from an unpasteurized life. Improvised on the front line of love